The 1990s, man. What a time to be alive, right? I mean, you had Pokemon, Windows 95, and this crazy thing called the World Wide Web. It was like a perfect storm of technology just exploding into our lives.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the web itself, it was the whole ecosystem coming together.
Affordable personal computers, widespread internet access, and browsers like Netscape that made it all accessible. It was a game changer.
Right, and people were like suddenly obsessed with the idea that you could sell, pretty much anything online. Amazon's a perfect example. Books online, back then, that sounded wild.
Yeah, and what Amazon did so well wasn't just selling books. It was their entire logistics operation. They focused on creating a seamless shopping experience, and it laid the groundwork for all e-commerce, really.
And eBay, I mean, they took this idea of connecting people to sell their crap at auction online, which feels totally normal now, but back then it was pretty radical. You know, suddenly you had this global garage sale at your fingertips.
Exactly. Both companies showed how the internet could create entirely new business models. It wasn't just putting existing stores online, it was rethinking commerce from the ground up.
And that's what made it so exciting for investors, right? People were throwing money at anything remotely internet related. .com became this magic word.
Which, in hindsight, wasn't all good. But at the time, the investor enthusiasm was like fuel on the fire. Venture capitalists were funding these startups left and right, and valuations were skyrocketing.
It became a total frenzy. Like, no one wanted to miss out on the next big thing, and sometimes that enthusiasm got a little over the top.
Definitely. It's safe to say that this era wasn't just about tech innovation, it was about the hype, too. But without that hype, we might not have seen the same level of rapid growth in the industry. It was a double-edged sword.
Totally. It's kind of funny to think about now. Some of those initial ideas were ahead of their time. Others were just, let's say optimistic. So, we've touched on those wild, optimistic ideas and the frenzy of the boom. But here's the thing. What goes up must come down, right? Let's talk about how all of that hype led to the .com crash.
It really comes down to the fundamentals, or more accurately, the lack of them. A lot of these .com companies were operating at ridiculous valuations without a clear path to profitability. Investors were hyper-focused on potential rather than actual business viability.
Right? It was like, hey, you've got a flashy website and a cool idea. Here's millions of dollars. But, most of those businesses weren't really making money.
Exactly. And a lot of them relied on one thing, advertising revenue. The problem was that market just wasn't big or sustainable enough at the time to cover their costs, let alone scale.
And when the hype started fading, investors panicked. I mean, we're talking about a $5 trillion market value loss within just a few years. That's massive.
Huge. And it wasn't just paper losses either. You had people losing jobs, companies folding almost overnight, and a ripple effect across the entire economy. The NASDAQ, for example, dropped nearly 80% from its peak in 2000.
Crazy. And then there's pets.com. I feel like that's the poster child for what went wrong during this time. I mean, a sock puppet mascot didn't exactly make up for a business model that didn't work.
Yeah, pets.com is a textbook case of scaling too fast without sustainability. They were spending almost as much on marketing as they were making in revenue, sometimes more. And their margins were razor thin, with shipping costs eating into profits.
And let's be real, the idea was ahead of its time. Buying pet supplies online sounds totally normal today, but in the late 90s, not so much. The infrastructure and consumer habits just weren't there yet.
Exactly. And Pets.com wasn't alone in this. So many companies were chasing growth at all costs, burning through cash at an unsustainable rate. When the funding dried up, there was nowhere else to turn.
Man, it's wild how quickly the tide turned. 1 minute, these startups were the darlings of Wall Street. The next, they were cautionary tales.
And it taught everyone a lesson, the hard way. You can't build a business on hype alone. But in some ways, the crash was a necessary correction for the industry to mature.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Like the .com crash was such a massive blow to the industry, but looking back, it's clear how it also set the stage for a tech comeback. It could have gone the way of fads that just fade out, like disco, but instead it evolved and came back stronger.
Yeah, but what's impressive is how quickly the industry evolved. It wasn't just about licking wounds, it was about creating a more sustainable approach. It forced companies to prioritize profitability over that growth at all costs mentality.
Totally. Like the startups that survived didn't just survive by luck. They shifted their focus, looked at the numbers, and went, okay, how do we make this work long term? It really set the stage for the tech giants we know today.
Absolutely. Companies like Amazon took those lessons to heart. They doubled down on efficient logistics and building a loyal customer base rather than just scaling for the sake of it. And look where they are now, $1 trillion company.
And on the other side, you had venture capitalists changing their playbooks. They started asking tougher questions like, what's your path to profitability? Or how do you sustain this over the next decade? You know, moving away from just throwing money at a cool website.
Exactly. And that shift meant funding started going toward ideas that were not only innovative, but also practical. Things that could attract paying customers or solve real world problems. That's really what fueled the next wave of tech growth.
Oh, and how about the way innovation itself changed, right? Like risk became a lot more calculated after the bust. People were still taking big swings, but they were looking at the costs and benefits a whole lot closer.
For sure. It's like the industry found a new balance between risk and innovation. Instead of chasing every new trend, companies started thinking long term, building products and services that could stand the test of time. And honestly, that caution has shaped the modern tech ecosystem.
Yeah, and it's why we see these giant companies today that feel practically unshakable. Google, Microsoft, Apple, they're built on the foundations of those hard lessons learned during the .com era.
Even startups today are more focused on metrics like customer acquisition cost or lifetime value analysis, things that were barely talked about in the 90s.
Wild how the crash, as painful as it was, it really helped shape the industry into what it is now. It's like the ultimate growing pain. And isn't it something how those lessons from the .com era, like balancing innovation with sustainability, still resonate today? It's like the ripple effects from those boom and bust years never really went away.
Definitely. I think the biggest takeaway for businesses, whether you're running a tech startup or a brick and mortar store, is to focus on sustainability. Hype and growth are great, but if the core structure isn't sound, it all falls apart.
Right? And we see that time and time again. It's not always about how fast you can grow, but how well you can adapt and stick to your fundamentals. That's what keeps you going during, tough times.
Exactly. And the .com crash highlighted that in a way no one could ignore. Now, it's about combining ambition with practicality, knowing your numbers, your audience, and your long-term goals. Those aren't just lessons for tech. They're for anyone running a business.
Which honestly makes me think, how many businesses today are looking ahead to the next big challenge, like cybersecurity? It's becoming such a key part of staying competitive, too.
Oh, absolutely. As the digital world grows, so do the risks. But we'll dive into that in the next episode when we take a closer look at how cybersecurity has evolved alongside the internet. It's a fascinating topic.
Can't wait for that one. And speaking of adapting and staying ahead, if you're running a business and need help with your website, SEO, social media management, or anything digital, you've got to check out modularity.us. We'd love to help you take your web game to the next level.
Yeah, we've been through the trenches and know what it takes to make digital solutions work. So reach out and let's see how we can help.
All right, that wraps it for today. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.